Good evening, and thank you for joining today's web seminar featuring Dr. Raúl Mora. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Alberto, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and me, Tuba Angay Crowder, Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We have also a research team of doctoral students from Georgia State University and a doctoral student from the University of Pennsylvania. GCLR as a research project seeks volunteers for our study of critical literacy professional development in online spaces. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area, and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. We also invite you to take our survey. The hyperlink is located on the GCLR website. The data collected will provide important information for understanding professional development as it is delivered through online technologies and its impact on international literacy discussions. During today's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Mora will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in this web seminar, so please use the chat box to type in from where you are watching this seminar or place a star on your location. Raúl Alberto Mora is a professor of English education and literacy at UPB Medellin in Colombia. At his university, he currently coordinates the MA in Learning and Teaching Processes in Second Languages. He is the author of many book chapters and articles. Among them are City Literacies in Second Languages, New Questions for Policy and Advocacy, and Critical Literacy as Policy and Advocacy, Lessons from Colombia. Dr. Mora participates on several editorial boards, including Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, where he currently serves as a Policy and Advocacy Department Editor, and the editorial boards for Profile and Half Journals in Colombia. Today's seminar will introduce questions that Dr. Mora and his research team have explored in their research agenda at the Literacies in Second Languages Project, LSLP. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Raúl Alberto Mora and his presentation entitled Rethinking Today's Language Ecologies, New Questions about Language Use and Literacy Practices. Dr. Mora, you're on. Dr. Mora, we cannot hear you.
How about now? How about now? Can everybody hear me now? Wonderful, wonderful. Sometimes technology plays those tricks on you, but I guess we're good to go. So first of all, I want to welcome everybody to our session, Rethinking Today's Language Ecologies, New Questions About Language Use and Literacy Practices. Before I begin, I think it's fair to give a little bit of credit where credit's due. And I want to first of all thank the GCLR team, particularly Peggy Alberto and Turba and Crowder, for the invitation and the support in putting this together. I always like to thank my wife because she's probably my biggest fan and friend, and she gives me a lot of support while I'm doing all these things. A big shout out to my own alma mater, the University of Illinois, our partners around the world, but most importantly, I want to take a second to acknowledge the great work and commitment of my research team, because without their work, without their interest in research, and without their concern about literacy, this presentation would never have happened. This presentation builds up from the research we have conducted at LSLP for the past 3 years, which comprises about 4 research projects, the work that we've been doing at the Master of Arts in Learning, Teaching, Processing Second Languages, and a series of publications, local presentations, international conference presentations that we have conducted over the time we've established the project. My presentation will try to encompass 2 things that have been working both individually and with my team since 2011. One is the problematization we've done of the idea of foreign language and why we need second languages in plural, and how that dovetails into our current work with the Literacy in Second Languages project and some examples of our current research. An important thing, because I brought this up in the title, it's discussing very briefly what language ecology is. And we use the idea of language ecology using the metaphor of an ecosystem. And if in an ecosystem, you have all the elements are supposed to coexist. If you take something out of the equation or you insert something into the ecosystem is going to lose its balance, and ultimately it's going to suffer. And we use the same metaphor for languages. If you have languages in contact and they're not working to sustain a balance in this linguistic ecosystem, we're going to suffer language loss. We're going to suffer unequal language practices. We're going to suffer linguistic discrimination and other matters. So that's why the concept of language ecology is so important to us, because it helps us understand that when we talk about languages, when we talk about literacy practices, we have to frame this in the sense of a more equitable society. Now, as they mentioned, I'm in Colombia. That's a little map of the country. As you can see, it's a wide country with a lot of diversity. The country comprises 32 departments or provinces with 45 million inhabitants, where Spanish is an official language. But at the same time, we have 67 languages that are indigenous, recognized by the government, 2 Afro-Colombian languages, the Romani language, and the Colombian Sign Language. However, and I find this to be baffling on many levels, our national bilingual plan usually only encompasses English and Spanish. So that's quite problematic if you think about it. So there's the question, why talk about second languages and why talk about it today? First of all, because the way language is happening today is very complex. Technology, social mobility, migration is affecting the way people play with languages, the way people appropriate languages. And that implies that people are finding new ways to play with language and finding new ways to use language and own it. Then we have matters of language equity, language access, language values that are present and becoming more and more important. Issues with life in borderlands, and how borderlands are creating new senses of languages and new ways to play with language. And then the virtual environments, where you have no boundaries, where you have no borders, where everybody is on the same level playing field. And with that sense, we have been problematizing this notion, the traditional notion of foreign language, which the way I see it, is mostly geographical. in the sense that if you're in the United States, then it's second language. If you're in Colombia, it's foreign language. If it's Britain, it's a second language. If it's China, it's a foreign language. If it's Ireland, it's a first language or second language. If it's Russian, it's a foreign language. And also, because this notion of foreign language seems to set very constrained glass ceilings in our students. So you can only learn this much because you're here. But if you were in another country, you could learn this much, and that doesn't make any sense. And it's also a source of a lot of social inequality. And I think anybody who's taught English as a different language knows very well this issue of native speakers and non-native speakers and how problematic that is in terms of the social constructions that we create about the quality of teaching. So let me give you two examples from Colombia where I feel that foreign language becomes irrelevant, to say in a way. And one is the example of the San Andres paradox. San Andres, Providencia, and Santa Catalina, it's a province in Colombia. It's an island in the Caribbean. And I had the chance to visit in 2012 with the Minister of Education. And we were discussing issues about languages and standards and policy, and I posed this paradox to them. In San Andres, we have three languages in contact. Spanish, which is the official language of Colombia. English, which is the traditional language of religion that has been in the island since the 1600s. And Creole, that is recognized, as I mentioned previously, as the native language of the local inhabitants of the island. So my question is, a question I usually challenge all my students with this question is, in this particular case, which of these three languages would you label as the foreign language? And that becomes problematic because I don't think you can label any of them as a foreign language. They all have particular reasons and particular logics, and they work in particular ways. Then there's a second example, and these are two schools that there's no need to name names, but I'll give you the context of the two schools. One school has 2 or 3 English teachers per grade, very few students per classroom, a lot of instruction per week. They have access to multiple resources, including online resources in English. Their teachers are either native speakers or advanced speakers of English, and they have a lot of chances to practice outside school. They got immersions, they have at home. And then you have the second school, which may have 1 or 2 teachers in the entire school to teach English, with a very large classroom, very few hours a week, and very little access or real of class. So my question here is, if you look at the curriculum and the structure of this first school in Medellin, do you see there an EFL and a foreign language structure, or this is something that resembles more a second language structure? And in that particular sense, what we have is a very glaring social inequality. And in that particular sense, those of us in literacy, we cannot condone frameworks that could lend themselves to social inequality. So that's why we have proposed the idea of second languages as a plural term. This definition that you have here, it belongs to a working definition by 2 of the researchers from LSLP, and they wrote a micro paper about it. And as you see, they talk about the idea that we care more about practice, we care more about appropriation, we care more about the use of language as a social phenomenon, as opposed to using the traditional yardsticks for language that we use as proficiency or level, or things that don't really give a fair account of how people use languages in real life. And from this idea of second languages, in 2012, we established the Literacy in Second Languages Project. And we find our work interesting for our context because the issue of bilingualism, it's a very big priority for the country, for the city, for the provinces. We have, for example, right now, the latest version of the bilingual policy in Colombia is called Colombia Very Well. All universities are now requiring a particular proficiency level, usually B2 from the Common European Framework for regular professionals, and for language teachers, the expectation is C1 in the Common European Framework. Then, and we find more language centers, there is more interest in learning English, there is more push for like journals and newspapers to publish articles in English. But at the same time, there seems to be a social imaginary, particularly in our hometown, where people still think that Medellin is monolingual, and that people don't speak English, so to speak. And that if you look at English and other languages around the city, you're going to find very little, if anything at all. And we decided to play with that a little bit. And we provided this a paradigm shift. So instead of looking for speakers of a language, we decided to start looking for people who used the language, regardless of proficiency. We started wondering how to use the language as a resource, and how this resource enriches the literacy practices in the city. And we stopped thinking about the idea that we have to bring second languages to the city, that we have to bring English to the city, and we started assuming that what if the language is already here? And what if don't know how this language appears in the city? And we started looking at literacy practices outside the traditional circles, and we started looking at the city as a source of literacy, but not being judgmental about the literacies. We want to look at kind of narratives, but we don't want to start judging whether people can speak English, or whether they're proficient, or whether they speak English fluently. Our research does not go there. We go more into looking at how language appears and how it plays out. So here's where we are, and that's a nice panoramic view of my hometown. It's called Medellin, but some of the local folk would pronounce it Medellin, like the word "gene" there. So that's why I did that little pronunciation thing. Medellin is the second largest city in the country, and it's a city that is facing a larger number of immigrants and tourists who are arriving in the city, who are settling in the city. So that is bringing a very different perspective to our languages. Allow me to take a moment and introduce very quickly our three research teams. The first team is the phase one, which is the one I'm going to be presenting for the most part today. We're 5 student researchers. They are all pre-service teachers in English Spanish education at my university. Right now we have 2 research teams working, one on the second phase of the Urban Literacies Project, that there are 7 students there. And then 4 students are involved in the Gaming Literacies Project. And in addition to this, we have about 7 or 8 grad students who are doing research on school literacies using some of the frameworks that I'm going to introduce in a second. So the first phase of the Urban Literacies Project was looking at what we call the physical spaces of the city. And we call them physical because they're mostly attached to buildings, attached to static events or static places in the city. So we looked at restaurants, advertisements, malls, bookshops, and libraries. And phase 2 is the one we're doing field work on right now. We are looking at the cultural spaces of the city. So we're looking at narratives of people who play with language, and we're looking at tattoos, graffiti, fashion, and music. In the Gaming Literacies Project, we have the first phase of the project. We started looking at what we call an ethnography of gamers as researchers. One of the strengths of the Gaming Literacies Project actually is that our researchers are gamers, and they are looking at it. They give me a very different perspective about what gaming entails. And for the first phase of the project, the researchers they started looking at this idea of English as a resource for victory, and we chose 4 specific kinds of games: the multiplayer online battle arenas, simulators, first-person shooters, and massively multiplayer online role-playing games. And based on the decisions, we discarded certain games that have appeared quite often in the literature, for example, like World of Warcraft, and we have moved on to others. Conceptually, our project uses this notion called the city as literacy, a concept that builds from the tradition of new literacy studies and some of the previous research they had done about literacy practice in the city, and it's adding 4 additional concepts that are helping us understand the complexity of literacy practices we find in our cities today. So we are relying on concepts such as multimodality, metrolingualism, polylanguaging, and superdiversity. Each of these concepts brings a particular feature of how we can look at languages in a more fluid way, in a more mobile way, and that way we can start looking at the city as what we like to say is a living entity that is constantly interplaying with texts, and a place where the texts are there, but the city also plays with the text and creates new texts. And in that way, we understand the city through these spaces as a literacy practice in and of itself. So let me share with you for a brief moment some of the things we have found in terms of how we begin to understand these literacy practices in the city. The first thing we have discovered is the need to start breaking those imaginaries that Medellin has to become bilingual, or in general, break the imaginaries that, in the case of Latin America, our cities have to become bilingual. If you know how to look and you know where to look carefully enough, you're going to start finding very interesting examples of English in other languages. We have found examples in French, we have found things in German, and people playing with languages and using references from the internet as another way to start constructing their texts. And we find that languages do coexist. We are not looking necessarily, and this is where we may take particular difference with other areas of research where they look at language interference. We are not concerned with interference, we're concerned with coexistence, and how people use the 2 languages, and how sometimes in the use of those languages there might be mistakes, or they might be playing with popular culture and popular cultural references from the city, but how English and Spanish in this particular case, they seem to be operating together to create a larger landscape of practices. Other things we have found in our research include that, first of all, we are finding messages that are far richer from what previous studies have shown. Some of the previous research mostly seem to link the use of English and the use of these practices in the city to the use of apostrophes in names as a symbol of status, or very, very limited words and phrases, whereas now we're finding something more complex, actual phrases, actual statements that are appearing in different parts of the city. Another thing that has been very surprising to us is how there seems to be an emergence of the use of foul language, the use of profanity in the names of brands and stores and restaurants, etc., and what it means for people to play with that in a second language environment and get away with it. Because I actually traced some of the names, and they had websites, and the websites actually used the foul language, and they worked. And that seems to be like a very normal thing of everyday practice in the city. And then there is also an issue with functionality of language and the kinds of reasons we find for people to use these languages or to use second languages. That is not simply because it's popular or because it's cool, but there are personal reasons behind it, reasons that reflect family history, heritage, personal narratives, and yes, a feeling with English, which is a very important thing, that people feel that just because I am not highly proficient or highly fluent, that doesn't mean I cannot play with the language. And I think that's a very important discovery of our research how people seem to be less afraid to play with language today. An interesting thing we have started to find in the second phase of research is how the issue of language economy appears as a factor, for example, in the choices people make for tattoos. And I'll explain that briefly. I'll take a minute to explain that one. And how people, for example, they realize that if you write the message in English, you need fewer words than you do in Spanish. And how that, for example, and not simply because it's English or because it's popular, but because of the language economy, has become a factor in the way or in the reasons why people choose English over other languages. And we have started to find in our research on video games that sometimes gamers choose to play in English, even if the proficiency is not allegedly high. It has to do with the access to communities and to the kinds of to escape certain levels of interactions that can happen in other communities if they chose a different language. So we start noticing that there are very deep reasons for people to choose the language, and they're not necessarily followed by the traditional understandings of language. So, and I think we're going to have plenty of time for a very hefty discussion because we're doing very well with timing. Where are we today in this? First, we find ourselves at a crossroads because we now want to know how to start translating this into the curriculum and into policy. We are now starting to think very carefully, how do we share these findings, not simply with the academic community, but with the community at large? How do we convey this message about how the city as literacy can be helpful in making decisions for language policy? And in fact, we dare to argue that what we also need to start thinking, not just about language policy, but also start thinking of a literacy policy for our countries. Because sometimes it seems that in the push for introducing the language, we forget about all the literacy practices that should be attached to it. And obviously how this translates to the curriculum, how we start using this information to help language teachers in the city. And that leads to the second point in the slide, which is the new uses for the city as a literacy. We are not going to go and say today that we should build an entire English curriculum where if that's the way you're going to learn English. But we believe that realizing how much English and how many second languages are present in the city can become a source of appropriation, or finding a real sense to appropriate the language. So that way the language doesn't seem that something that is not akin to people or that people shouldn't care about, but we can give people stronger reasons and a more valid rationale for learning the languages. And I think that revalues the city as a site of learning, because sometimes the school and the city, they seem to be separate from one another. They seem to work as two events that don't necessarily connect with each other. And there is a sense of the critical consciousness about how we look at language and look at cities again. And we say that, as I said, our cities are not monolingual. They might not necessarily be multilingual in that very traditional sense, but there are cities where second languages become a communicative resource, a very powerful communicative resource. And that's why he says these are polylanguage and multimodal. And we need to acknowledge that in the construction, in the way we look at the city as a place where we live and as a place where we interact. And again, we bring it back to that construction of the curriculum, because that brings a whole different ballgame. And we can start looking at the city as a part of the school where there is a lot of interplay with language. And we can start looking more carefully at the idea of coexistence. Because once you look at the issues across languages, you realize that if you were to take it on a metacognitive, say, perspective, there is a lot of information that you can transfer across first and second languages, and there are a lot of things that you can do to help your students improve their learning. So we're gonna have about 25 minutes for what I hope will be a very productive chat. So once again, I want to thank you all. I was following some of the discussions in the chat, and I saw some very interesting questions there. For more information about the project, you can basically take a look at our website, literacycinLTproject.org. Check us also on Twitter, on Instagram, check our videos on YouTube. And I, again, want to thank you all. And again, I want to take one moment to thank again my research team, because all the pictures that you saw today, all the data that I talked about today was the product of the field work that they conducted in phase one. I'm not involved in field work now, but the field work in the first phase of the project was entirely the student researchers. So they deserve all the credit, they deserve the recognition of the hard work they put together to get this project and to get the LSLP running. Now I'm gonna move it back to the moderator, and I'll be ready to start taking questions from the audience. Tua?
Thank you, Dr. Mora, for your insightful and engaging presentation. We now invite Dr. Mora to respond to the questions that participants have generated across the presentation. Please continue to type in your questions in the question and answer session facilitated by Dr. Alberto.
Thank you, Dr. Mora. That was a very enlightening and very interesting discussion about foreign language and language ecology. We had a number of questions generated by our participants, and one of them asks, in my country, Turkey, English is considered a foreign language, but then why do some universities or other formal institutions require English as mandatory?
You see, thank you. That's a very good question, and I think that actually stems from some of the misunderstandings about what foreign language or second language is, and because once you start mandating it, that gets things. I mean, it becomes more complicated. In that sense, we say, like, when we talk about second languages, we say, well, first of all, it's not about mandating it. It's about giving people a chance to appropriate it, and most importantly, give them a good reason. I think one of the problems of many language policies in Turkey, and I know that's the case in Colombia, is we tell people to learn it. We tell people to learn this second language. We just never give them a very good reason why. So obviously, when you don't have a very good reason why, there begins a sense of resistance. Because we feel that even in Colombia, there is resistance to the policies, not because the policy doesn't make sense or the policy is not, let's say, the spirit of the word, it's not good. It's that we haven't really built a case for why people should learn a second language. And it should go beyond policy, and it should go beyond economics. It should go into how the second language helps you build a better kind of individual. If we give if we give this a more humane dimension, it's possible that once we give it a more humane dimension to language learning, policy is going to fall more easily and is going to promote better practices.
Thank you for that. Another question that was generated by our participants was, how does research around language ecology help us work with or against standardized measures of language learning, especially for language learners in countries like the U.S. that promote English-only learning?
That's a really good question. And it goes back, I would say it goes back into the sense of balance, the sense of equilibrium that I was talking about. And one of the things that in sense of language ecology, that it requires, in order for that to happen, it requires a very particular sense of advocacy, not just at the grassroots level, but some of my own research, I tend to say, well, universities and colleges of education, we have a moral imperative and a moral responsibility to promote a very different sense of dialogue about how forcing people to forgo one language or for forfeit a language is detrimental to their very participation in society. That if I deny people the chance to use them with this, and I know very well the case of the United States and the English-only policies, that some of them seem to be driven by this fear of people disrupting English, when research proves that people don't want to forfeit English. They just want to be able to speak English in their mother language or their heritage language. So I think the fight for standardized testing from the central language perspective comes from the notion of what we do at a grassroots level from academia to sustain this linguistic ecosystem. So that there is also a call, as I mentioned at the very last slide, there's a call for advocacy, and the kind of advocacy that we have to engage in from different levels to really bring this message in a way that hopefully is clear to policymakers. But that's a very long battle ahead. And just as it's happening in the United States, it's happening here, because here, for example, as I mentioned, we have 67 indigenous languages. And if you read some of the laws of the Ministry of Education, they seem to be nowhere in the equation. So we talk about English and we talk about Spanish, but we don't really talk about how what should be a multilingual language policy is going to keep in mind those 71 languages, because we have larger problems in the horizon, like the issues of people who speak sign language, and then for them Spanish is the second language. How do we operate there? So all these issues bring up a matter of advocacy and how we organize ourselves from the different areas where we can develop that or engage in that sense of advocacy. And we do it, again, I repeat, to sustain the environment. Peggy, if I may, I would like to tackle one question that I found very intriguing. Because there's a question here from Nicole Pettit about let me see if I can find it real quick. It had to do with linguistic landscapes. So if I may, I want to tackle that. I would like to take a stab at that question.
Dr. Mora, that's fine. Dr. Alvarez got disconnected. This is Mandy, and I will ask the questions from here if she isn't able to. But if you find that question and would like to respond, that would be great.
Yes, because actually, Nicole, thank you for bringing that question up. Because our research is not that far off the idea of linguistic landscaping. We're not using that particularly. We're not using the concept of linguistic landscapes directly, but I know what you're talking about, and it's not very different. In fact, I'm very sure that some ideas that we talked about, like metrolingualism, they seem to be going back and forth, because Pennycook seems to move between linguistics and literacy quite often. We cannot talk about the city of literacy because we really want to go into the literacy strand and keep in mind that we want to make it more of a semiotic and linguistic and aesthetic dimension that we want to add to this. But one thing that we are contemplating, and I like the question because one of the things we are contemplating, and I'm going to write this also here on the chat, is how we're going to incorporate the idea of soundscaping into this current phase of our research on the on the cultural spaces. We are trying to figure out how to do it in a way that is not overly intrusive and that might not get us in an ethical quandary. But right now we are worried because we we look at the city, but we realize that one of the things we have to do is listen to the city and figure out a way. I mean, I'm still trying to, and I say this, for example, because if you take our metro, which is our public transportation system, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, it was very unusual to hear people speaking English. And when you would speak in English, people would look at you like a freak, excuse my language. But I've noticed in recent interactions, and I noticed that sometimes when I used to take the metro with my wife, because we both speak English because we got married in the States, we would speak in English, and you have, instead of people looking at you weird, you will have people eavesdropping on you. And that's a big shift on how people perceive second language in the city, that now is not something that people chastise, but people pay attention to. So the soundscaping matter, it's a question we're really thinking long and hard on how to do it. I mean, we want to do it, we just haven't figured out how to do it. And I can solemnly promise all of you that as soon as we have that answer, we will let you know. But I think that was a very, very interesting question about linguistic landscaping. Are there any other questions?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Mora. Another question we received was, how does code switching fit into your discussion of foreign language?
I'm not sure if foreign languages really keep in mind the notion of code switching. Because if you look at the more foreign language, the concept, they kind of require you to stick as much as you can into that limited practice of that language. Whereas in the concept of second languages, as we pluralize it, and wow, that's a very good question, by the way. Since second languages seem to be something that the user, people themselves will choose what the second language looks like and how it operates, this idea of code switching can become a necessary tool even for intercultural communication. We find examples of code mixing and code switching in our research, and for me, when I mean code switching is what I was calling before this language coexistence. Because I'm really opposed to looking. I mean, I know some people have built an entire body of research about linguistic interference. I personally prefer to look at coexistence because I find that code switching is can be a very valuable tool. And even if you know how to give it a pedagogical twist, it can actually be very useful in helping your students gain confidence in the use of the second language. And there is a vast body of research in bilingual education that proves that code switching can be a very useful pedagogical tool if properly used.
Thank you. I have another question if you're up for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
I wonder if English is tied to an ideology of economic advancement. Does English equal money?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we have to keep it real. And yes, there is an ideological matter there. And that when I talked about the issue of why, some of the policies around the world when it comes to English are driven by economics. But the problem is, while economics are important to people, people might operate with different standards. And you can push English as an economic tool, but that doesn't mean people are willing to welcome it with open arms. Because as I said, we haven't given people a real valid reason for why second languages are going to really make their life better. And I don't mean this in the sense of you're going to make more money. Money is important and we all need it. But there has to be something bigger and larger in the sense of why we appropriate languages. So yes, there is an ideological matter. And I probably am not the first person to say this. I mean, Pennycook was one of the he denounced this in his work on critical linguistics a long time ago. So I'm not saying something that scholarship hasn't denounced before. But in that sense, the recognition of this ideology can become a source for us to give people a better, and again, I'm going to go back into that word, into that humane dimension of language learning that is so absent sometimes from the curricula and from policy. It's important to think of economy, but that cannot be the only driving force behind pedagogical decisions.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Mora. I'm back. I'm sorry I got kicked off. We have another question from another participant who asks, language as a resource is critical. However, how does one convince policymakers that languages other than English are resources for English-speaking populations? And how does one get through this very powerful position that English has in the world?
Okay, that's a very convoluted question, so let me try to tackle it. I would say, I'm going to begin with part two. And I would say, well, this reminds me of a very long argument I used to have with my advisor with the metaphor of you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's home. For me, you can use the master's tools to dismantle the master's home. And what I'm saying is that we can use English, I'm going to say against English for lack of a better word, but you can use English as a way to prove that English is not the only way, is not the only one. Since English is going to be more widespread, maybe, and this again is a whole issue of advocacy, it's a multi-layered approach. But one thing we could do is those of us, and I'm going to say, for example, in places like Latin America, those of us who have the command of English, we have to use that to promote the counter narratives of people who may not have the access otherwise. And that is the first way to start creating a consciousness that languages are other resources. Another important thing that has to do with policy, but it's also involved with the curriculum, it's how we build the curriculum in a way, the language curriculum and the curriculum in general, in a way that languages within the curriculum are variable resources for people to use. How we enable spaces in the classrooms for people to use those languages that they find as valuable resources. And we also have to break the imaginary that you have to be, quote unquote, proficient in a language to be able to use it. I think as long as you find a sense of usefulness for the few words that you know in a language, and you can use those words within your larger discourse, you somehow speak and you somehow use the language, and that deserves validation. That deserves recognition. Because sometimes, and especially in the sense of how we understand, when it comes to policy again, how we understand, for example, bilingualism. Because bilingualism seems to be understood as something that is very monolithic and only like a one-size-fits-all approach or a one-size-fits-all definition. So, and that is a very long road ahead. That is a long uphill battle that we all, and when I say we, it's not an editorial we, it's not a collective we, it's a real we, because I am deeply invested in those questions you're asking about language as a resource, the issues of policy, the issues of ecology. I think those are very important matters, and those are matters that within the research team, gradually, we are beginning to tackle.
Okay, so did you want me to repeat the first part of the question, or do you think did you want to answer any more about that first part about policymakers? How do we talk to policymakers?
Well, I think the first thing we have to do is maybe go talk to them. I mean, at least in my experience in Colombia, I have found that sometimes, for whatever reason, sometimes universities and policymakers don't talk. They just sometimes don't. And I wonder to what extent what we need to do is actually approach them. I mean, that may sound really naive to me, but sometimes because I have conversations with people from the Ministry of Education, I realize that sometimes academics don't reach out to them. And sometimes so I think it's a matter of reaching out and forcing this conversation at a very grassroots level, but we have to enforce the conversation so they start listening to our research. And I'm going to pick up on what Nicole is writing here about professional organizations. And I think professional organizations have a responsibility to take stock on these matters.
Okay, that's fantastic. So I guess we'll go back to Nicole's question then. I wonder about the role of professional organizations in equipping teachers and faculty and grad students in learning how to advocate with policymakers. Do you have any suggestions, Dr. Mora?
Yes. And that question really hits close to home because I am a professor in the Faculty of Education. So I work and I coordinate a master's program. And those issues of how to advocate, they're pressing matters. And I think the first thing we have to do is the issue of advocacy and the issues of policy have to be part of the curriculum. We cannot detach the curriculum from advocacy. And there are different levels of advocacy. I mean, I'm not necessarily expecting pre-service teachers to go all out and do or try to wage some of the battles that I, as a researcher, as a university professor, I'm supposed to wage. But there are certain levels of consciousness raising that they can do from the beginning of their career. And then we have to start realizing, okay, what are the layers of advocacy that we need? What are the layers of advocacy that we have to establish at the pre-service level, at the in-service level, at the graduate level, at the doctoral level, and begin by infusing the curriculum, just as we have infused our curriculum, our curricula with this heavy research component that we find across pre-service programs and graduate programs. We can gradually, within our coursework, include something as simple as discussions and readings about about advocacy and policy, and start from there. I mean, sometimes we have to find simple solutions and start building from there. And I think the simplest solution to start with that is how we infuse it in the curriculum and how professional organizations who are constantly making statements make sure those statements make it to the desks of the policymakers. And then we can start thinking of what other levels we need and what kind of research we need to do and how we need to present it, because maybe we have to present in academic journals, but we also have to start finding more alternative outlets for the presentation of our findings so that they are more accessible to the public.
Thank you for that. Could you talk a little bit about your research project, and do you feel that your research project is having an effect in your country, Colombia, in terms of how it views language as ecology?
Okay. Our project we have been LSLP has been around for 3 years, but I would say the heavy bulk of work we have done has basically been 2013, 2014, and this first semester. We are gradually beginning to disseminate that work. So right now, I would say the effect is something that we have to start showing, because we have been trying to build a case first and build a robust body of research. But in general, one interesting thing is that the field of literacy research at large is very much uncharted territory in this country. I mean, there are other pressing matters in language education, and there are other pressing matters for the language teaching community. Literacy is a topic that people are just beginning to recognize. I mean, people are beginning to understand how it has to do with language, and it has to do with learning, and it has to do with policy. But it has been a very slow process. And I feel that the more we start presenting this locally and internationally, that is going to give us, enough chips to bargain, and it's going to help us create a sense of gravitas that then we can later translate into curriculum, into policy. But it has, when we have started really, I would say we have started small scale, and we're now starting to grow little by little. And I would say in a way, presenting our work in an outlet like GCLR and some of the publications we've done recently is helping us establish that we have a body of research that can become useful. And as we go, we probably begin to start finding particular allies in different areas in the country that can help us disseminate the message.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Mora. It does take time for impact to happen, and sometimes impact doesn't always happen, even with the best of efforts. So it's really encouraging to know that we need to continue to pursue that avenue of pushing policymakers towards helping us understand language learning and providing legislation that will give us the, what do I want to say, that give us the liberty to work with language as a resource. So that actually concludes our Q&A, Dr. Mora. I am going to pass this back to Tuba. And again, thank you very much for an enlightening presentation.
Thank you. The pleasure was all mine.
Thank you again, Dr. Mora, for your passion and interest in understanding the literacies in second languages and multilingual literacy practices in today's world. We would appreciate you taking a moment to type into the chat area one thought about this web seminar. Please help support the GCLR research project by taking the GCLR survey. The link is located on the home page of the GCLR website. Additionally, if you are willing to participate in a 15 or 20-minute interview about the GCLR, please type your name and email address into the chat area, and someone from the research team will contact you within a few days to schedule an interview. We also have a doctoral mentoring web seminar series with 2 feature presentations. Please share this information with your students and colleagues. We want to thank GCLR audience for participating in the 2014 and 2015 series of seminars. Please look for updates on the list of speakers for the 2015 and 2016 series. On behalf of the entire GCLR research team and me, Tuba Angay Crowder, thank you for joining us today.
Their work, without their interest in research, and without their concern about literacy, this presentation would never have happened. This presentation builds up from the research we have conducted at LSLT for the past 3 years, which comprises about 4 research projects, the work that we've been doing at the Master of Arts in Learning, Teaching, Processing Second Languages, and a series of publications, local presentations, international conference presentations that we have conducted over the time we've established the project. My presentation will try to encompass 2 things I have been working both individually and with my team since 2011. One is the problematization we've done of the idea of foreign language and why we need second languages in plural, and how that dovetails into our current work with the Literacy in Second Languages project and some examples of our current research. An important thing, because I brought this up in the title, it's discussing very briefly what language ecology is. And we use the idea of language ecology using the metaphor of an ecosystem. And if in an ecosystem, you have all the elements are supposed to coexist. If you take something out of the equation or you insert something into the ecosystem is going to lose its balance, and ultimately it's going to suffer. And we use the same metaphor for languages. If you have languages in contact and they're not working to sustain a balance in this linguistic ecosystem, we're going to suffer language loss, we're going to suffer unequal language practices, we're going to suffer linguistic discrimination and other matters. So that's why the concept of language ecology is so important to us, because it...
Or place a star on your location. Raúl Alberto Mora is a professor of English education and literacy at UPB Medellin in Colombia. At his university, he currently coordinates the MA in Learning and Teaching Processes in Second Languages. He is the author of many book chapters and articles. Among them are City Literacies in Second Languages, New Questions for Policy and Advocacy, and Critical Literacy as Policy and Advocacy, Lessons from Colombia. Dr. Mora participates on several editorial boards, including Journal of Adolescent and Adult Literacy, where he currently serves as a Policy and Advocacy Department Editor, and the editorial boards for Profile and Half Journals in Colombia. Today's seminar will introduce questions that Dr. Mora and his research team have explored in their research agenda at the Literacies in Second Languages Project, LSLP. At this time, please join me in welcoming Dr. Raúl Alberto Mora and his presentation entitled Rethinking Today's Language Ecologies, New Questions about Language. Good evening, and thank you for joining today's web seminar featuring Dr. Raúl Mora. Your moderators for this evening are Dr. Peggy Albers, Professor of Language and Literacy at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia, USA, and me, Tuba Angay Crowder, Language and Literacy doctoral student at Georgia State University. We have also a research team of doctoral students from Georgia State University and a doctoral student from the University of Pennsylvania. GCLR as a research project seeks volunteers for our study of critical literacy professional development in online spaces. If you are willing to participate in a brief interview, please type your email address into the chat area, and a research team member will contact you within a few days to schedule an appointment. We also invite you to take our survey. The hyperlink is located on the GCLR website. The data collected will provide important information for understanding professional development as it is delivered through online technologies and its impact on international literacy discussions. During today's web seminar, if you have any comments or questions, please type them into the chat box, and Dr. Mora will address these at the end of his presentation. We would love to know from where you are participating in this web seminar, so please use the chat box to type in from where you are watching this seminar, Language and Literacy Practices. Dr. Mora, you're on. Dr. Mora, we cannot hear you.
How about How about now? Can everybody hear me now? Wonderful, wonderful. Sometimes technology plays those tricks on you, but I guess we're good to go. So first of all, I want to welcome everybody to our session, Rethinking Today's Language Ecologies, New Questions About Language Use and Literacy Practices. Before I begin, I think it's fair to give a little bit of credit where credit's due. And I want to first of all thank the GCLR team, particularly Peggy Alberto and Crowder, for the invitation and the support in putting this together. I always like to thank my wife because she's probably my biggest fan and friend, and she gives me all her support while I'm doing all these things. A big shout out to my own alma mater, the University of Illinois, our partners around the world, but most importantly, I want to take a second to acknowledge the great work and commitment of my research team, because without helps us understand that when we talk about languages, when we talk about literacy practices, we have to frame this in the sense of a more equitable society. Now, as they mentioned, I'm in Colombia. That's a little map of the country. As you can see, it's a wide country with a lot of diversity. The country comprises 32 departments or provinces with 45 million inhabitants, where Spanish is an official language. But at the same time, we have 67 languages that are indigenous, recognized by the government, 2 Afro-Colombian languages, the Romani language, and the Colombian Sign Language. However, and I find this to be baffling on many levels, our national bilingual plan usually only encompasses English and Spanish. So that's quite problematic if you think about it. So there's the question, why talk about second languages and why talk about it today? First of all, because the way language is happening today is very complex. Technology, social mobility, migration is affecting the way people play with languages, the way people appropriate languages. And that implies that people are finding new ways to play with language and finding new ways to use language and own it. Then we have matters of language equity, language access, language values that are present and becoming more and more important. Issues with life in borderlands, and how borderlands are creating new sensitive languages and new ways to play with language. And then the virtual environments where you have no boundaries, where you have no borders, where everybody is on the same level playing field. And with that sense, we have been problematizing these